Hello and welcome back to The Commonplace. My name is Autumn Kern and I am joined today with my friend who many of you will recognize as I think we almost make a yearly appearance over here on YouTube or the podcast. My friend, Mrs. Amanda Faus. Amanda, welcome back to The Commonplace.
Thank you so much for having me. I wouldn't have it any other way than making an annual appearance on The Commonplace.
Sure. And I'm glad that I have not been on YouTube at all in 2025. I've kind of just taken this extended break. My baby's coming soon, God willing. And I'm just like, I'll be back when I'm back. But then I realized that we are in that time when homeschool moms feel the urge to plan for next year while trying to make it through the doldrums of this year. And of course, that meant I needed to come back and partially update people on how my first year with the children's tradition, which is the curriculum that Amanda wrote, how that's been. I've had some follow-up questions since we released last time that you were launching this beta year and everything. And then also the TCT, I always do that, but it's TCT, the children's tradition, is now going to be in its full form for 2025, 2026. So we have a lot to talk about because you've added some really helpful resources, you've expanded sections, and hopefully we can talk about all of it today. So as we get started, how would you give us your brief bio of what you're doing in life right now?
Oh man, well, what I'm doing in life usually is being a mom to my 5 children. I'm growing a 6th child, so that takes up a lot of time. But besides that, I have been, in very, very deep researching for just revisions and ways to clarify and expand the beta version of the children's tradition. As you know, Autumn, and most people who've been following along with the beta, that started out as something that was originally just for myself. And then I realized I was going to give it to the world. And so then I was in a flurry to present it to the world and got as much done as I possibly could before hitting publish on, the date that we had chosen. But then from there, I really knew that was just a stepping stone to get feedback from families, right? To hear from those who were using it. And then 2, to continue to research on John Senior, on the philosophy of poetic knowledge. And so that's what I've been doing, honestly, is just diving deeply into those things. Every now and then I do a podcast, the Wonder Years podcast, where we'll talk about the liberal arts tradition. But mostly I have just been writing, working on honing the children's tradition, and then also doing a class on poetic knowledge in the children's tradition circle community, which is called the toolshed. So I do that, and then the rest of the time I'm homeschooling because that's what we do.
Right. I can't remember if last time we spoke, toolshed wasn't a thing yet. That came after we launched our interview, right?
Yeah, it was one of those things that almost immediately after I released the beta, I mean, there was a couple things when I released the beta. First of all, you know this, Autumn, but I thought at that time, maybe 50 or 100 people will be interested in this, this really niche group of Mason homeschoolers who are wanting to go deeper into the classical wardrobe, but there's not very many of us, who really value philosophy and going deep. No, there are so many of these women who I was just delighted to be connected with through the Common House, for sure. So many common moms. And then also finding this broader world of John Senior fans who love and adore John Senior. And we're all like myself, why did no one ever make a John Senior based curriculum? This seems like an obvious thing that someone should have done. And so I was very happy to get to be the one to do it. But that meant that I got to hear from a lot of people, talk to a lot of people, and see them implementing it. And then they were quickly we need a place to talk. If you're going to give us this curriculum, that's great. But now where do we talk to the people who are doing it as well? I know a lot of people want to start a tutorial program or a co-op. So even that aspect, they were hey, we need to have a landing place so we can reach out and start establishing local groups and finding people in our area. So it is still very much in the beginning phases. It's only a couple hundred people right now, but it's growing every day. Almost every day somebody joins. And I'm really excited about the potential it has in the future to expand things like providing a lesson planning course and more classes on poetic knowledge, just as we try to get deeper into the philosophy, helping families do that and also apply it though. At the end of the day, as much as I love all the big philosophical ideas, I know it matters a lot to us homeschoolers. Okay, but what does this look like in our day to day? And honestly, the best way to do that more often than not, though, is just hearing from other people who are doing it. So the toolshed is organized by the same way the curriculum is structured: knowledge of God, knowledge of man, knowledge of the universe. And then people can go in those spaces and dialogue about specific books, about questions they're having, applications, et cetera, based off of within those categories. So it's nice because it's organized, but still very much a free zone for people to talk and share.
Yeah. It's a wonderful resource because, again, it starts with philosophy, which is something that I know matters to the two of us quite a bit, that moms understand the foundational things that they're now trying to put into practice in their homes. But then moms will hop in the tool shed and they'll share, like, this is the timetable I made, or this is how I'm going to maybe do my exams, or this is how I think I might introduce it at co-op, or I'm struggling with this one resource. How are you guys having your children engage with this? And people will jump in. And I love that sort of community. I think when you have a type of curriculum and you're all working towards the same ends and you're working with the same materials, it's really nice to be able to hop on and learn from each other and yet still always have that philosophical foundation, like the Poetic Knowledge Book Club. I think that's a great thing for you to be teaching through because that's a fun phrase that not many people necessarily know in the educational world or what it means. And so maybe even I have so many questions about the coming full curriculum, but for those who maybe have landed here and didn't hear our last conversation, I will link it so you can go and listen to the welcome, this new thing exists and I'm so excited that Amanda has made it. But who's John Senior? Like, let's give them a little bit of touch point. Who's John Senior and how did that become the children's tradition?
Yeah, so John Senior was a professor at the Integrated Humanities program at the University of Kansas in the 1980s. But specifically, he and two other professors, Dennis Quinn and Franklin Neelick, taught a Great Books program, this integrated humanities program, with a vision for teaching in the poetic mode. Okay, well, what does that mean? Teaching in the poetic mode was teaching in a way that would appeal to the senses, a sensory emotional mode of learning. So they did things like give conversational lectures on stage in front of all their students, where the students were not allowed to take notes because they were to attend with full attention to the lecture and just receive a really unstructured lecture because it was a conversation. It was just the two or three of them talking and sharing ideas, and then the students receiving and growing from that experience. They did things like stargazing. They did things like memorize poetry. And really, this program came from John Senior's idea that great book students, which is what those professors were, they taught the great books. So you're thinking, think of Homer's The Iliad and the Odyssey, right? These were or the Divine Comedy. These were the books they were teaching initially. But what they realized was that students were not prepared, even at college age students were not prepared to engage those texts in meaningful ways. And so the two things they were missing were experiences of reality, so like the physical natural world, so looking at the stars, getting out in nature, just paying attention to what happens when you walk out of their door. Like, even this is 40 years ago, but even then people were already too much inside and didn't have a really deep connection anymore to like knowing where the sun is at a certain time of day, like basic realities that historically almost everyone knew because they lived a much more, a life that was much more active outside. And then two, that they needed what Senior describes as the good books as preparation for the great books. And so this is a list that ultimately he ended up writing down later, the 1,000 good books. But this idea that you need a rich literary foundation of fables, fairy tales, myths, legends. You need to have read the things that Shakespeare wouldn't probably have read a lot of time, he would have heard. So that's an interesting thing. There's a lot of these things that we now read in the good books are actually oral traditions that now we have in books. But someone like Shakespeare, or if you go back even further, someone like Socrates, Socrates would have heard the Aesop's fables orally. So it's interesting how we are now, trying to recover this inheritance that for many people for a long time was actually an oral inheritance. But needless to say, we now have many of those written down. And then you also have just works of the Western canon that are, again, we wouldn't call them a great book necessarily, but they are a good, solid piece of literature that prepares students to better understand the great books, often because those books are deeply and profoundly influenced by the great books. So examples of this would be Little Women or Gene Stratton Porter. It's not that they are great books, but both of those authors, Gene Stratton Porter and Louisa May Alcott, were both deeply and profoundly influenced by the great books themselves. And this came out in their writing. C.S. Lewis is a favorite of yours and mine. He is not on the good books list, which is the only travesty of the list. But he is a great example of that too, right? You see the influence of the great books on C.S. Lewis in his good books. So all of that to say, this was really the vision of John Senior, the IHP, as someone who is deeply rooted in the great tradition. I will bring up John Senior's name all the time, and I'm not bringing it up because I'm just like a John Senior fangirl. It's because John Senior so excellently and profoundly expressed the ideas of the great tradition. He backed up everything he said. Maybe that's an exaggeration. He backed up most of what he said with ideas that he would trace directly back to Greco-Roman philosophy, to books within the tradition. And so he didn't just come up with ideas out of thin air, right? Whether it was his ideas about gymnastic and musical education with the poetic mode, or his ideas about like the art of teaching. How do we teach? Or why do we teach at this age this way and that age that way? All of these ideas ultimately came from his deep study of the tradition, that now in this time, I think the classical education movement is asking a lot of questions. And John Sr., in my opinion, is the best one to answer a lot of those questions, because he pulled from so much wisdom and study in his own life. But ultimately, in that, again, that poetic mode, that he was not some rationalistic, apologetic defender of classical education. He lived the classical tradition. He embodied it in the way he spoke and the way he taught. Everything he did. And so that's where I'm really grateful for his work. And then the way that has connected to the curriculum is that I used that list he gave, the 1,000 good books list, as well as everything I could possibly get my hand on from his teaching, whether that's the books he's written. He wrote Death of Christian Culture, Restoration of Christian Culture. He has a biographer who wrote John Sr. and the Restoration of Realism, who Father Bethel in his own right is a wonderful a wonderful philosopher and thinker who is able to express ideas very clearly and interestingly. And then in addition, this past 6 months, I was able to get access to Idea of a School, which is John Sr.'s unpublished manuscript, where I then again got to go deeper into his work. And so in all these things, I synthesized the ideas that I received from John Sr., his articulation of the great tradition, and then I synthesized them to form the children's tradition curriculum.
Yes. One thing that I really loved when reading through the children's tradition the first time was that you also synthesized people that we both love, like Charlotte Mason, into John Sr. It was not like this is not a curriculum built on the back of one man. And even when you were sharing about how the IHP would invite students into listening to conversations, not taking notes, practicing full attending, then going out and learning from books and things, ideas and things, like the Charlotte Mason mom, or even the mom who would say she's classical, should already hear a lot of things that are attractive to us in this model of education. And so I feel like this is the perfect bridge over into a new piece that you've added to the children's tradition. It's a section called The Ages of Man, which I was reading earlier today. And this is one, structurally, you've changed how you're organizing the program from Mason's forms to these, it's the 7 stages, right? There's 7 ages, rather, not stages. That's the next thing about to come. The 7 ages of man.
Not stages.
Yes, which if you've studied Cole's paintings, this should ring a bell to you, or for you, and it's even the cover of the curriculum. So my daughter absolutely loved studying those paintings last year, and so she even loves the front of the children's tradition. But then also, this is, I think, just like the slam dunk critique of the neoclassical ages and stages model that many of us, especially when we first enter into classical education, a lot of the resources you'll run into, you don't know that there's a difference between classical and neoclassical. You find Dorothy Sayers' Lost Tools of Learning essay. You hear about the trivium matching developmental stages. And this is a very popular idea that hopefully eventually you learn is a neoclassical version and not the more historic tradition, which, back to your point, Senior was trying to pull from the most historic places that he could, the resources that he chose from the sources that he had. And so I would absolutely love if you could tell us about the ages of man, because I did want to just post this all over the internet after I read it today as a help, as genuinely to be a help, not to actually slam dunk on anyone or embarrass anyone, but to truly be a help to understand how a whole person enters into education and how education should nurture the whole person at every part of their life.
Yeah. Well, first, to piggyback on what you were saying about Mason and tying into everything, it's so true, because that's what ultimately my goal with the children's tradition is, to articulate on every level that I'm capable of. Okay, where do we get this idea from? Who started it? Like, what's the earliest source I can find on it? And then, like, how can we trace that idea throughout the tradition, that this wasn't just like one guy said it once, but actually it was maintained, so that we could actually say that we are seeking to implement pedagogies that are 1,500 years old, 2,000 years old, that are genuinely time tested. The word time tested gets thrown around a lot in the classical world, but it begs the question, well, you have to show that this idea was time tested if you're going to say that your curriculum is.
Mm-hmm.
And so I definitely felt the weight of that. And that's why Mason is so wonderful as she integrates into all that, because she, even many times when she was not citing the tradition, was actually articulating ideas on behalf of a very real living tradition that makes, I think, is why her work is so powerful. Mm-hmm. But that really does then connect, exactly like you're saying, to this idea of the ages of man. So to give some context for those who are new to this conversation, it is very common, like you said, for people to come into the classical world, I know myself included, through hearing about things that are based off of a trivium-based method, ages and stages approach to learning. So in this method, it'll say that the liberal arts, there's 7 liberal arts, but specifically the first 3 liberal arts, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, that these correspond as stages of learning to elementary school, middle school, and high school. Now, what I think is really interesting about this is that if you actually go back and read Dorothy Sayers' essay, like you mentioned, Lost Tools of Learning, she herself says in her essay that she is theorizing, she's forming her own theory of education, and she herself calls it unorthodox, that this is not the straight teaching of the past. This is my ideas that I'm just thinking up on my own as just an observation, in her case, of her own childhood, as she reflects back on her own childhood. And then she was a lover of medieval history and that period of time. And so she wanted to take those stages and take the liberal arts and apply them as stages to children. There was just a couple problems with this. One, and again, as she knew, this is not historical. Nobody did this before. The liberal arts has always been college and university level education. The trivium was traditionally college, and then the quadrivium was traditionally the university. Oh, I apologize. You're fine. Shut that off real quick. I just realized I turned off Do Not Disturb for me. Yeah. So the liberal arts were traditionally college and university level education. And so historically, there was a tradition of what was required to go before that. And that's where a lot of seniors' ideas come in. But I think the bigger aspect that I want people to understand of why seniors' work is really essential in this particular moment is because people who have been in the trivium-based classical education movement have experienced a lot of disappointment and frustration as they've come to realize that, just practically speaking, what she claimed in that essay does not actually happen. Mm-hmm. So this idea of like, oh, you just have kids memorize in the elementary years, all these facts, and that facts are a peg upon which ideas will hang. And then you can come back later when they're in like middle school and high school, and you can build out from there based off of these fact pegs. And yet educators who have actually implemented this in the classroom have seen firsthand that didn't even work. Mm-hmm. There's a wonderful article, I should say, by Rachel Woodham, who on the Searcy Institute, where she just describes her experience as teaching 4th grade for years, where she was gruelingly trying to implement this method that she did not see children enjoying the way Dorothy Sayers said children would enjoy. And yet she thought, okay, all for the cause. I got to implement this because it's going to be worth it later. And then she went on to teach 11th grade, only to find that her students who had been in that program the entire time had no promised fact peg, mm-hmm. but they remembered a story. Mm-hmm. And so this idea that, that children are made this way really ultimately has been tried and found wanting. Additionally, the concern I have with that method is that she argues within her essay on the basis of a couple of things, and particularly on the basis of children's natural vices and how we can cultivate those vices to educate them. Yep. So in the case of the whole parrot child, the elementary schooler, she says, oh, well, if you give them all these facts to memorize, they're going to have a pleasant sensation of superiority. So they're going to love how that feels to have all these little facts stored up. So you should totally use that for their education. Or the other example she gives is the logic stage. She says, oh, yes, I know middle schoolers, they're so argumentative. It's really annoying. They're nearly insufferable. And I know parents are going to resist my suggestion that we teach them logic and argumentation at that age for that very reason. But her response is, they're already insufferable at that age. So we might as well canalize that insufferability towards their education.
The Mason flag is like going up.
Mason flags are very strong right now. Because what does Mason talk about? One of the principles that many people in modernity misunderstand about from Mason is the idea that we are to respect the personality of children. Because they think she's saying some modernized weird thing about like self-expression. That's not what Mason was talking about at all. What she was saying is you ought not to manipulate a child's vices or natural bents towards, certain flaws, whether they're a people pleaser or easily intimidated or whatever their vices might be, that you should not manipulate those vices and play upon those vices in the name of, well, this will get them more educated, right? So if you have a child who is very responsive to, because they're a people pleaser, to praise, you do not then intentionally shower on praise to evoke that child to want to learn from you more, right? She would see that as it's manipulation. It's really a betrayal of their nature that you are, capitalizing on their sin tendency. So this is where ultimately Charlotte Mason, John Sr., who had much more experience with children. Charlotte Mason as an educator who actually was in classrooms with children, John Sr. as a father at the very least. Whereas Dorothy Sayers, God bless her, she was an academic. She was a marketer. She had one child who she did not raise herself due to difficult circumstances. So her experience of children beyond her own childhood is really lacking. And I think ultimately exposes her lack of understanding education to not primarily be about teaching somebody what to think or how to think, but is about shaping the whole person, that this is a soul, which I should then add was the main thrust of the Lost Tools of Learning is, the goal of education is to teach students how to think, not what to think.
Right. That's the banner.
That, again, is this idea, you can't possibly teach somebody how to think without teaching them what to think. So again, it's an idea that has been tried and found wanting. And so Senior comes in and really speaks to all of these issues because he understood that education was fundamentally about communion with God. He really loved the rule of St. Benedict. And so he centered a lot of his educational philosophy as far as, and not just educational philosophy, I should say, his philosophy of culture around this idea of how do we restore Christian culture? Well, we restore it in the home by implementing prayer, by implementing the reading of scripture, by reading good books out loud around the family hearth, around the fire, right? Restoring family culture, because if we can restore family cultures that are rich in ideas and truth, goodness, and beauty, then that is ultimately what will restore the culture. And so he saw education fundamentally as, again, soul care, about caring for the souls and bodies of children. Mason, of course, as well, echoed these ideas. And so you have in that, he actually has a fabulous quote where he basically says that it is a travesty to take the liberal arts and put them down into the younger years, because what Dorothy Sayers was not wrong about is that the trivium is the art of thinking. She's completely right about that. It is how to think. However, until a student has had years upon years, John Sr. would say, the full elementary, middle school, and high school time period to be filled up with really what he calls understanding. So there's the idea that you have to have understanding before you can reason. When we think of the word understanding, what does that mean? To stand under, to come under things. So really what we're saying is a student has to have years upon years of their imagination, their memory, their intellect being filled with true, good, and beautiful ideas, right? Well-chosen ones, the ones that have stood the test of time, the best that has been thought and said. We take all of that and we spend years filling their soul up with it, so that they actually later, when they get to the art of thinking, the skills of how to think, they actually have something to work upon, right? That there's something inside their soul. And the second part of this is that with poetic knowledge, we understand, and John Sr. taught very strongly, that the formative power of those true, good, and beautiful experiences and stories that you are filling your child's life and soul up with are so profoundly formational that you are shaping them. C.S. Lewis has that quote from Abolition of Man, right? Before a child reaches the age of reason, so that when the child reaches the age of reason, he will greet her, right? And with joy. It's that idea that children, even a 15-year-old, is not at the age of reason. They're not reasonable. Right. The nerd. So let me this is a good point where I should explain. So let me explain what the progression of the ages of man are, as Senior articulates them. Since that is connected to all this and is really his solution, we might say, to this idea of, do we do stages of learning, or in his case, ages of man? So with the ages of man, you have this idea that there are 7 ages of man, that you have the infant, you have the schoolboy, you have the youth, you have the man, you have I can't even remember now all the older ones, but there's basically all these stages, right, that come down to like 7 to 10 year chunks for each one. And so the infant or the nursery is 0 to 7 years old. And so, like you said, in the curriculum, I've structured it so that first and second grade are part of the nursery. So while we do begin formal lessons in first and second grade, that is going to shape our approach, right? That we are being much gentler. We understand the priority of gymnastic, physical senses education, that they are, yes, they will learn through stories, but they mostly are learning through tasting and touching and experiencing physical reality. And then starting around third grade, from 8 to 13, we have the school child. So the school child is going to be focused on real things, right? They're all about common sense. They want to know the real world. Is this true? Is this real? Like, how would that be? They love tales of adventure because they can go on this journey around the world while they're sitting in their bed. And so that age group is particularly suited in that way. And then by around 13, 14 years old, they reach adolescence, which in seniors reckoning, in the classical traditions reckoning, goes till like late 20s. So like think 25, 26, 27. So we think of adolescence like the 4 years of high school, but really the adolescent mind in terms of like what motivates a person at this age, what actually inspires their actions. Well, for a high schooler or for an adolescent, it's really it's eros, it's love, it's this idea of romance, of I want to I want what I do to matter in the world, right? And so they're sifting through all these ideas, but they're not very rational, really. Like they might like the idea of being rational because to them it appeals on some level of their image of themselves, but they don't actually usually make choices on the basis of, well, this is just the most logical thing, so I'm going to do that. But they are moved by stories. They are moved by love. They are in love with love. They are in love with the world. And senior, what I love about senior is I think a lot of times, especially for those of us who value logic and reason, as we all do, especially as adults, is we can look down on that stage as like, look at these foolish kids. Like they're just, all they think about is romance. It's so dumb. And, they just need to grow up and like live a life. And yet senior really saw the beauty in God, like our God-given progression as human beings, that this is exactly how God made us to be. Like that age is well suited to, yes, love, and they want these stories of romance. Then let's direct that towards stories that show them how to love rightly. Let's direct them to stories that show what happens when you don't love rightly and the consequences of that. And again, giving them an education that forms them on the basis of how they're made. And so to tie this all back together, I don't think that Dorothy Sayers' essay took off for any bad reason. And in fact, I really don't even want this to be understood as a criticism so much as a let's continue having the conversation now that educators are asking questions in response to all these problems that have come up. And yet John Sr. provides these wonderful ideas and solutions, reminding us, guys, liberal arts, college level education, let's get back to historically what elementary, middle school, and high schoolers were meant to do. And I will say we do understand that historically people did go to college a lot earlier, before. But I think where we have to accommodate for that is recognizing that we are trying to recover a type of education that we are not there yet. So the reason people could go off to college by 13 or 14 years old was because they had gotten schooled in only Latin and Greek for the entire time. Like they were receiving a very firsthand grammar education, if you will, rooted in the languages that really defined academia for 2,000 years. And so, up until, I believe I checked this out recently, even in America, it was not until like 1940, I want to say, that like the 1940s, that Latin was not required for entry into colleges.
Yeah.
Like 1940s, like not even 100 years ago.
Not that long ago.
So this is what it meant to be educated. So yes, it was a different thing at that time where people were educated in that language. If you're thinking of the Greco-Romans, if you're thinking of the medievals, they were educated in these languages. Also, the stories that we have to all fill in our curriculum with fairy tales, myths, legends, nobody was going to school for that historically. They got that in the culture. The problem we're in is that our culture is so deprived that we have to now like fill out our curriculum in preparation. So that's why John Sr. advocates for 12 years, what he calls the 12 years of prerequisites, even though we understand people did often go to college earlier. At this point in time where we're at in the recovery, wisdom would probably say we need the full 12 years of school to prepare for something that's still not quite the college education that people were receiving a few hundred years ago, but we're at least on the path back, right? If we keep seeking to recover those lost languages, if we keep seeking to educate people and fill their imagination and memories, we could get there within a few generations, but we're not there yet. So knowing, not only knowing man, right, understanding man and our nature, the growth and natural ages of man that humanity experiences, but also understanding our present moment of, okay, well, where are we at in this recovery? Because we're not at the same place that the Greco-Romans were at or the medievals, not even close. So what do we do about that? And that's where I find John Sr.'s wisdom compelling, insightful, and really powerful to answer the questions we're all asking.
Now, this is kind of a one-off question, but I was curious if you know if in other parts of the world, if there is a classical education renewal in a similar sense to the States, but two, if you would say it's American or maybe Western to always want to do things earlier, like the boom of like baby art class and baby gymnastics class, and trying to take the liberal arts and bring them down as if having it earlier, kind of Dorothy Sayers' point, like the earliest point that we can as they start kindergarten, first grade with the pole parroting. If that's more of an American take on what has been the renewal for us here, or if you have maybe know anything about other places in the world.
So it's interesting. I mean, I wouldn't want to pretend like I know a ton, but what I will say I have observed, I don't know that it's just America. I think it's the developed world. So I would say those who are like, so America, Britain, Australia, right? Those of us who are like on the forefront of the developing Western world probably are all kind of on the same page of that, exactly like you said. Actually, John Sr. talked about how, or not John Sr., I apologize, in the book Education in Antiquity by H.I. Moreau, he talks about how this is actually a trend of cultures generally, is that as they get more sophisticated and developed, they will then start to funnel more and more subjects down because they basically become like fat with all this knowledge and with all this things that, oh, well, we need to know all this stuff. And so then what happens is it gets funneled down to the younger children. And then what ends up happening is basically the educational system will kind of combust, and then they'll go back to the basics again. And then they kind of build out again, and it happens in a cycle over and over again. So that's kind of an interesting thought. I will say I've talked to some friends who are from some less developed countries. For example, I have a friend from Romania, and she told me how there are a lot of things like they start school later, right? So when I like have told her some of the ideas about like delaying education, that so we have the nursery, she's like, oh, well, yeah, that's just what we did in Romania. Like, so I think on the one hand, we might, as moderns think, oh, see, Romania is less developed, but I don't think it's actually so much that Romania is less developed, though of course there are real issues with that. But as far as education goes, in some sense, modernity just hasn't touched them as much. By this point, they have. She's my age, so she would say that her own childhood is more faithful to, and her own experience of education was more faithful to the type of education we're trying to give our kids as classical educators than what she knows that her family and friends who live there today are experiencing, that they're catching up, unfortunately. But as far as, I think it's an interesting thought as far as, around the world, that maybe the quote unquote less developed countries might have held on to some of the more traditional wisdom around education.
For sure. Yeah. I was curious if you had also had a curiosity and chased it a little bit to see what was going on in other places. One thing that I know, I'm sure you have heard just getting feedback, because I know that part of your beta launch was to hear from moms and families and what they thought this year. And so anecdotally from our own experience, this year has had this element of like restfulness or leisure to our learning, if you will. And because, yes, a lot of the moms within Common House have also used the beta program this past year, I hear echoed again and again that something feels so life-giving, even though maybe they're using some of the same books they purchased when they had a different, like Charlotte Mason curriculum. They still have delayers or something like that. But there's something that people can't put their finger on exactly about how the year has felt so restful and life-giving. And I think it's this ages of man, the way you've built out, like meeting the child where they are, giving them touch points with reality. My second formal student, we've spent so much time out of doors. We've spent so much time engaging with real things. And of course, we've had our stories and we've worked on our sums and our handwriting and things like that. But again, these all, again, build out the full embodied sense of wonder. as he and also my daughter, but engage with reality as it is. And you did mention gymnastics. I heard it come out in some of that. And I want to take you there because that's a section that you've continued to build out. And I know Amanda mentioned her podcast. It is called The Wonder Years, and she hosted alongside of her husband, Patrick. And they have spent some solid time trying to describe and explain a gymnastic and musical education in the early years. But a lot of parents have like literal gymnastics in mind when they hear that word. They're thinking, oh, you want my kid to do splits or run around the house, like something with their body, probably. And so I wanted to give you time to explain this element of the gymnastic, of the real in those nursery and early school years. So how would you briefly introduce gymnastics to a mother at the park or something?
Yeah. So it's a very fitting question because I actually just this past week somebody asked something to the effect of like, I would be really sold on this, except for I just don't buy it that kids can learn only through books. Like that you're just wanting them to learn everything through only books and they never do anything like that. Just doesn't sound like a full education to me. And my response was, I am so glad you don't feel that way because that is not what I am saying at all.
No, not at all.
Yeah, because and I think because many people do hear initially, you know, the bite that gets them to look at the children's tradition is something about the 1,000 good books as preparation for the great books, which is wonderful and obviously is incredibly central to the curriculum. However, yes, gymnastic education, which is the gymnastic mode of learning, we could say, which is the mode most relevant to the school child, to the nursery years as well, but especially to the school child, is gymnos is from naked wrestling with reality, like naked wrestling. So what we're talking about is a naked wrestling. I would say in the experience of my own toddlers, often quite literally, right? They run around in their diapers, if we can keep them on, and they're running around just exploring the whole world, right?
Dirt, food, their sibling, anything.
Everything, right?
Mom.
Look at you.
Yes. A lot of mom. Let's touch bellies. Yeah.
We are such a great object for them to wrestle with.
Yes.
So when we talk about the gymnastic mode, what we're talking about is the absolute need of babies, infants, toddlers, school children to get their hands on the real world, to get out there and yes, dig in the dirt and bask in the sun and look up at the clouds and roll in the grass and play with the dog and ride a horse and do all these things that are just experiencing the real world. Mm-hmm. The child is born into the world having zero experiences of reality. Their first experience, right, their first sensory physical experience is their mother cuddling us and we love it. And it's so precious. And then their world expands out from there slowly but surely. And so that is what gymnastic education is. We are always beginning with how can we teach this in a way that will get at their senses, both their outer senses and their inner senses. So their outer senses, self-explanatory, right? Taste, touch, eyes, sounds, etc. And then their inner senses, their imagination, their memory, their common sense of the world, right? This is a cup of water. I see a cup of water. You see a cup of water. We both know it's a cup of water. This is our common sense, right? This common sense is formed in community as we converse together and explain to the small child, this is a cup of water. This is a chair. This is a book, etc. So all of these things are being formed in them. And in it, they're having that naked wrestling happening. So hopefully we can get some clothes on them by the time they are school age, although the Greeks and Romans didn't think that was necessary. They were like, keep them naked until like 12, 13, but maybe even later, you know? I'm pretty sure the wrestlers were still naked in the Greco-Roman. So.
I was thinking of Anthony Eslin talking about how boys and girls should be educated separately and like his reason.
John Senior was a very strong proponent of that. All of his quotes that you will
boys.
Are about boys.
I saw your footnote about that. I will say Amanda did very kindly footnote that he's often talking about a school of boys, and so she pulled what is applicable to both genders, like the quotes and the things she did keep in context for that. So in case you're reading it and wondering that, I did catch that footnote earlier today. Yes, okay. So I think that is part of the finger tapping around trying to figure out what it is about TCT that feels different at the table. I think it's that, and I think it's the poetic mode. And I think these two things are just, for most of us, I mean, they're completely new terms within their proper context. And then they're just protecting what is so precious and God-given to then allow the child to flourish. And I know that there's that urge. I know we've talked about this a lot just as friends offline. That urge when your oldest is 3 and you're like, well, this curriculum is built on Winnie the Pooh, and Winnie the Pooh is something you have to read. And yes, it is on the 1,000 good books list, but it's like, let's make each week a letter, and we'll bake a thing that matches the letter, and we'll say the letter, and we'll write the letter, and we'll read this chapter. And it's just this desire in moms to teach and impart. And that is what education is too, is passing on norms. Like, it is passing on. We are trying to bring some nutrition to the soil as we pass it on. And I feel for the mom who asks in Common House all the time, my 4-year-old, what can I be doing for a curriculum? Like, you can go outside and you can have them fold laundry with you, and you can grow vegetables and eat them and go sit in the sun and learn about the stars. And that is not just wasted years. It's not wasted time. In fact, it's foundational. It's necessary for what you envision and hope for in the future. And I think the children's tradition has made that very accessible. And even if a mom is not yet able to articulate it, because that comes later, I think, in educational philosophy, like then you start to have the language for things if you're not studying it all the time. But I do continue to hear that echo on like, there's something there for me this year, and it's very different. And even I, as the tutor, the mother teacher, feel so much more peace, and like we are just delighting in what God has made for us in a way that is cultivating true love and wonder. And wonder, if you don't know, is Amanda Foss's talking point for education. Nothing is learned without the wonder. And so that's all through the curriculum and still is. But I did want to jump to another part that you expanded, which was your composition section. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. It's late for Amanda and I, and we were both pregnant. So yes, the composition section. You added a little bit in there, and I would love to know what you're most excited to introduce to TCT families. Like, what are you really excited for moms to learn about in this expanded section?
Yeah, well, so kind of like you're saying right now about the nursery years, and people are like, oh, I want to start with my 4-year-old. So one thing I will say before I jump to the composition thing is that all the time I got asked, okay, great. So can you write a preschool curriculum?
Yeah, you did.
All the time. And for a little bit, I was like, well, I can't write you a preschool curriculum because there's no lesson plans to write for preschool. And by preschool, I'm meaning preschool, not just, 4-year-olds. But as I thought, well, maybe I'll make them a resource. Like, I was like, I didn't want to just leave them hanging. I understand that urge. I had the same urge. We all get it.
Urge. We had it. We had it.
So then with that, the thing that ultimately I landed on, though, was I'm like, there's really no reason to create a resource right now. I didn't really have the time to make a completely separate resource. So I thought, you know what I'm going to do is I am just going to more clearly articulate throughout the entire curriculum the natural flow from preschool nursery years into then the nursery years that, yes, are formal lessons, and then into school years. You kind of have a natural division in the school years, right? Like 3rd and 4th grade is kind of like a school years lower, and then 5th through 7th kind of functions as a school years upper. So one thing I know many of us desire is to kind of know, like, okay, where am I at and where am I going, right? And so even if you're a young mom with a 4-year-old, I think there is so much benefit in you having a vision of, like you mentioned earlier, the philosophy of the poetic mode of learning, right? How do we give this education in wonder, this sensory emotional experience of reality? How do we do that? Because that is equally for this 2-year-old as it is for the 7-year-old, even though formal lessons are not yet occurring. But then also John Sr. did have things like picture books and poetry, like Mother Goose poetry. He was really into the Mother Goose poetry rhymes. There's a series on YouTube. I think you actually would have to go on the Children's Tradition website to get the link to it, because it's not accessible if you search for it. But it's called Good Reading for Children. It's a 10-part series where John Sr. and Dennis Quinn are talking, and they spend the first 3 hours talking about only Mother Goose. So this is like how deeply John Sr. was in love with Mother Goose. I now have fallen in love as well, but I needed him to explain to me why we loved Mother Goose. Now I'm sold now. But needless to say, so there's some really actually important, valuable things you can do. I know, Autumn, you have mentioned in the past that you did like a benediction table starting with your daughter when she was young, right? We did a similar thing. We didn't know it was called a benediction table yet. We did morning time, but this idea, right? Now within the curriculum, I recommend nursery school. So what is nursery school, right? It's, we just sit down, we read Mother Goose, we read Kate Greenway, we read Beatrix Potter, right? We're reading all these authors that are wonderful preparation for the first novels they will encounter in year 1, like Winnie the Pooh, Wind of the Willows, etc. So all that to say, with the composition section, A funny thing I noticed after I published the beta was that I never once told anybody what narration was or how to do it. Now, thankfully,
Did you not? I mean,
but
were
the,
we the
I
same
mean,
with Mason that we were like, we know how to narrate in a lesson? Like, yeah.
I got away with it because yes, the people who got the beta were all like educators who were willing to take a chance on it because they were kind of deeply root, like they knew what they wanted. I don't think the people who bought the beta were usually moms who had no background in learning anything about educational philosophy. Like they had gone through, as you like to say, the classical wardrobe. They had fallen in love with Mason, so they were already sold on certain ideas that they definitely already knew what narration was. Probably thanks to you. By the time they read it, so that nobody ever asked me. It wasn't even like someone mentioned to me, like, "Oh, do you notice you never talk about this?" Like, no one did. I just eventually, as reviewing it, was like, where do I tell anyone what narration is and why we do it? And but it actually, but the timing was fine because ultimately, I was able to go deeper into some really interesting studies. Part of, so while I continued studying John Senior this year, rereading Mason, things like that, another thing I just was doing was trying to build out my understanding of just education historically. And so I was really interested in things like, okay, we all know Charlotte Mason for narration, obviously, but where did she get that, or where did it come from initially? And then I initially was found, okay, it's in the Pro Gymnasmata, right? So the Pro Gymnasmata is like the classical writing rhetoric curriculum, I should say, pre rhetoric exercises for students to do before they would go to rhetoric school. And so I had encountered that okay, well, one of the first exercises that you narrate an Aesop's fable. So that was interesting to me. But then later I also found in Quintilian, he has, what is his book called? De Oratorio, something like that, like on being an orator, something like that. And he actually explicitly outlines what he calls paraphrasing. Paraphrasing ultimately, and it is what we now often more familiarly will call narration. But I think knowing that Quintilian called it paraphrasing is super helpful, because even the past few months, I've heard people kind of rediscussing, like, well, what is narration? Is it a summary? Is it a, something else, right? That's kind of like most people, they hear narration and they think we're saying, oh, a child should give us a summary of what has been read to them. Really, a paraphrase is a better word, because what we're asking the child to do is to recreate what they just heard with their own words. This is the way they participate in that story, or what that they heard, is that ability to become the narrator themselves and share that story with us. So that's a big difference between just merely externally summarizing what was heard. So what I did in the composition, and the other aspect of this is, as I went back to read Mason again, I noticed that she did not primarily call narration, though she does talk about narration. She called it oral composition. And this flowed very well with her progression of going from oral composition to written composition, which is, again, what we would tend to call written narrations. In both cases, she used the word composition. And so I ultimately landed on, well, let's recover that word instead of using our own words all the time. I love when we can find an idea in an old author, right? And instead of trying to, re-explain it for the new world, it's like, no, let's just go back and find out what they meant and let's implement what they said. And so what I did much more clearly this time was explain that progression from oral composition as paraphrasing, as we get from Quintilian, and then at that progression to go to do copywork. So you kind of have two things going on from the beginning. You have the oral compositions, and then you have copywork, which is where they are just, it's handwriting, right? So which, in the children's tradition, we recommend cursive. So they're writing beautiful things in a beautiful way. So beauty is in everything that we do. And then they move from that into dictation exercises in year 4. Which dictation exercises, if you're not familiar, would be something like you have your child, let's say the very first time you ever do it, you'd start very simple. So you'd have your child look at Little Boy Blue. And so they have to read, but at this point they're 4th grade, they can read, right? So they're reading, okay, Little Boy Blue, come blow your horn, the sheep's in the meadow, and they have to keep looking at it and try to make sure they know how to spell every word in that poem. And then when they think that they know it, you'll take it away from them and you will read it to them, and they have to write it down without being able to see it. And this is actually like the Mason way to teach spelling, right? So instead of giving them a spelling list, we give them something living. We give them a poem or a Aesop's fable or a few lines from a literature novel. And and then we ultimately expand to, by 7th grade, they're doing this with like 2 to 3 pages of a literature novel. So large portions by 7th grade. But the idea is they need to learn to look at what they're seeing on a page, take a picture with their mind,
Mm-hmm.
save that image right in their imagination, and then recall it with their memory. So that's dictation exercises. And then in the same year, we also begin written narrations or written compositions. So this is where starting once a week in year 4, we have students, instead of giving us an oral narration of one of their books, we have them do a written narration, which in a year 4 student will probably be like 3 sentences to start, because they will have not done a ton of writing up until that point. They will have done mostly copy work. So, it's an interesting moment of change, because you'll find by year 3 or 4, they are like insane narrators. If you've been doing it from year 1, they can just narrate like everything for like in such great detail that you're almost as a parent like, okay, can we get through this? Like, that's so nice that you know like every single detail. I love that about you, but like, okay, I'm kind of tired of listening to all these details. I was just here. I remember the story. Like, oh, I get to do it. So it's like, I see the wisdom of the timing of like, okay, now we're not stopping oral narration by any stretch at year 4, but at least we're kind of slowly making that transition to, all right, let's move some of this to the written, to doing written narration, which really slows them down and causes them, for a little bit, they do return to doing something more like summarizing, because they're taking, this whole story, a whole chapter, and they're fitting it into a couple sentences. So it's not true narration at that point. They're back to summarizing, and you kind of have to like expand them out again. But the idea is, I think as an educator, I think for all of us, we want to know, where am I and where am I going? And so to get that whole cohesive picture, and then even to know, okay, now for between year 4, year 5, year 6, year 7, how do we slowly expand? Because you're just layering. You have, okay, we start with copy work, then we add 1 dictation, 1 written narration. Okay, we do that for 2 years. Like, let them find their feet, let them get a little longer. But then, okay, next year we're going to add 2 written narrations. By year 7, 3 written narrations. So, and then we're also expanding the length, right? We start with those a couple sentences, but then let's say by 6th grade, let's aim for 1 to 2 paragraphs. And then by 7, so trying to give everyone that holistic vision, and also letting us all know, it takes some courage, especially in the early years, to delay a writing curriculum in today's world, because if you are in any sort of school that is has to follow state standards or things like that, there's going to be a questioning of your decision. And so I think even for moms to have the confidence, like, I know why we're not doing this right now, because it is not developmentally appropriate for a 2nd grader or a 1st grader to be writing paragraphs yet. What is developmentally appropriate is for them to learn to orally express ideas and stories that they have heard, and to express them well, which, if you think about it, is a skill that many people today as grown adults do not have the skill or capacity to hear what someone has just said to them and repeat it back. Like, this is an adult level skill that if we would just have done it when they were little children, when it was much more natural to them to learn, that we could have avoided a whole lot of disagreements, probably, because people are frustratedly yelling past each other because nobody's actually hearing anyone and can't articulate the other side. But 2, this idea of, okay, we're doing these oral narrations, we're building up that power of memory and imagination, but we are going to get there. Like, this is not an approach that doesn't value writing, as if we just, who cares about writing? We're just, not taking it seriously. No, we're absolutely taking it very seriously. We're filling them, again, with the best that has been thought and said, so that through imitation, they can become not just good writers, but great writers who have taken in all these beautiful words and poems and prose into their heart, that then later, as we slowly start to get asked for more out of them, that they will be prepared. In the adolescent level of the curriculum, which I plan to write in a few years, we will start doing those progymnasmata exercises, where these are rhetorical exercises, but they're also exercises, because they're rhetorical exercises, that can be used to teach writing. So yes, we begin with something as simple as write a narration of a fable, but then we do something like, okay, now you're going to write your own fable. Okay, now you need to create a moral for the fable you just wrote. Okay, now you're going to take a proverb, and you're going to take that proverb and defend why that proverb is true. Right? So you see how it's slowly developing that movement from, I'm just taking things in like a sponge, and then I'm paraphrasing, I'm replaying, I'm giving back what I received, to a slow, gentle transition to articulating more and more unique thoughts, which is that pathway that's preparing them to be capable of independent thought, those arts of thinking that they'll experience, especially in the college years.
Right. I almost have goosebumps going back to when you talked about understanding earlier, like to sit under something and to think about the rich well that a child who has been reading Aesop and working with fables and myths and fairy tales and all of that, like you said, sponge in, but also just working within them. Like when Mason talks about ideas, how they seize and they take over and they shape your picture of the good life. They shape your understanding of reality. They shape how you think you should be moving in it. And then to be asked, after all of those years, you're now going to put your effort to writing your own fable. And everything they're pulling from, if you grabbed me, an average common person off the street, and said, like, write a fable, I read them with my kids, but I would sit there like, okay. It would come out very analytically. Like, it wouldn't just be coming out from within necessarily, because I'm basically a third grader in my classical world, right? Like I'm basically a third grader. And so I had goosebumps just listening to that. Like, and I know not every mom is the type who wants to like speak on educational philosophy, and maybe she's more intuitive about following the approach and understanding it. But everyone knows that feeling when you're at like Thanksgiving with a bunch of family members and they're like, ask your kids some questions and it doesn't seem like they know how to write anything. You're like, why? What? How do I explain this to you? How do I explain this to you?
Now,
which is what I love about, I mean, the children's tradition is, it's almost 300 pages of philosophy in there. And that's not to overwhelm anyone. It's just the detail given to help a mom have the vision of what are we doing now and where are we headed. And it actually made me think of one thing that I know I've received like a million questions on your behalf is history, because Mrs. Amanda Faus does not have a comprehensive history curriculum going on in the early years. So can you tell us briefly what it is that you introduce, this concept of historical fiction and story as the primary like history text of the curriculum in the early years, and then where it's going to go?
Yeah, no, I know. I think that was one of the things that I got the most comments about. Initially was like, she's trying to throw away history. I'm like,
cycle, 6-year cycle.
Yeah. No, I'm not. But yes, so within Senior's 1000 Good Books list, you have a number of works of, yes, historical fiction, which we begin starting in third grade. I actually added some Mason, like not directly from Charlotte Mason, but in the Mason World Recs to build out the first and second grade, because there really were no books that were suited to that age group yet. And there was no history books on the nursery years portion of his list. But as far as the school years were concerned, in third grade, we start with gently with Little House on the Prairie. And then in year 4, yes, we start with some G.A. Henty. Last year in the beta, I did recommend that families incorporate one of Charlotte Mason's recommendations, which is to read the medieval chroniclers. This would be like The Life of Alfred by Asser or The Chronicles of Kings or things like that, which all of those books were written in the medieval period by monks who were, chronological. I'm not even going to try to say that word right now, but they were trying to make these chronicles, right, of whether it was ecclesiastical history of England by Bede, all of these different chronological histories that were from that actual time period, though. So very much not firsthand accounts, but close, like very close to firsthand accounts. So Charlotte Mason recommended those to be read starting throughout the elementary years and was kind of like, you should just pick one a year. I made that suggestion in the book, but I didn't schedule it in the beta. Whereas this time I did put it in the schedule to make it easier for families to actually follow that recommendation of, okay, here's what it would look like. I did delay, instead of doing it for all of the elementary years, I did wait till the school years, because after having read some of them myself, I was like, this is really more suited at least to the school years. So you have the layers of, we're doing historical fiction. And then you have, yes, we're doing these medieval chroniclers. And then around starting in year 5, we start bringing in more historical sources, which are from the 1000 Good Books list. So he had, in the school years, he had different like memoirs, travel diaries, some like naval tales that were based off of real life events. And so those sorts of stories form a new stream that we add, a new history stream that we add in year 5, that we are slowly just reading people's firsthand experiences of something. So one of them is Robert Louis Stevenson. He wrote 3 different memoirs on his travels. called The Amateur Immigrant. And then I'm forgetting the other two titles right now. But it's just really fascinating stuff. Like you're just reading him tell you about like, oh yeah, so I traveled to this location and I saw these people and I was riding this train. And oh, there were some Chinese immigrants on the train. And this is what people usually think about Chinese people right now. And let's be honest, it's not very kind, but I've been observing them on this train. And let me tell you, they are wonderful people. And I think that they are these, worthy of all of our honor and respect. And so it's very interesting because he gives you insight into like, what's really happening. People are not being kind to these immigrants. And, as he's going across on the train in North America, and yet also saying, and you see almost why his book has stood the test of time, because he shows a higher approach of thinking, right? Of, no, I'm observing these people. What I heard was not true. And I see humanity in them. I see something worthy of honor and praise in them. And so I think they're great, is basically his takeaway. And then he moves on to the next thing. And throughout that, he does like little essays about writing and, oh, if you wanted to be a writer. And so it's like this very just human piece of writing where you're like, interesting. It's like your travel blog. It's like some thoughts about if someone wants to be a writer. It's like this categories of things. But it's a firsthand source. It's a historical source that tells you what it was really like during that time period from his perspective, obviously. And then we do that from a few different angles. There's some Western ones that are about just like life on the prairie and life as a cowboy, because of course, John Sr. loved that stuff as a cowboy lover himself. And so things like that. So you have these historical accounts that we are also weaving in. So what we're doing through it all is building just layer by layer, yes, this historical stream. What I would add to that, though, is what cannot be underestimated is what was his initial program called? It was called the Integrated Humanities Program. And so what is at the heart of this curriculum and at this method of education is an integrated view of knowledge. So what I would love to offer as an encouragement and as an assurance to parents who do follow this type of method for teaching history is that history is everywhere in what we are doing. Like we are doing myths and legends that are all teaching you about history. We are reading literature novels that, even though they're not, yes, as a genre, historical fiction, for example, they're still more often than not period pieces of fiction that are written in a time that is giving your child this sensory, emotional, imaginative experience of a time and place that is not their own. And then in addition, what I emphasize in the curriculum is that, again, because of that gymnastic mode of learning, we do not prioritize with young children. The first priority should not actually be all the books we're reading about history. It should be take your children to your own local history and go learn about it. See what they can see what they can hear, do the tours, visit the places, go to Colonial Williamsburg, whatever it might be. Recently that we live in California. So there's a lot of Spanish missions in California, right? These are things that for my children as Californians, they should know about the Spanish missions in a way that maybe somebody who lives in New York does not know. Not that someone in New York won't know that they existed, but they're not going to have an intimate knowledge of the Spanish missions in California the way we will. And that's okay. Children should, as we talked about earlier with the expansion of their imagination, that it slowly expands, their world grows bigger. This is equally true of how children should come to understand history. So really the best thing to do is to start with, in the nursery years before they've even started formal lessons, your family history. Something that my daughter did that I thought was so precious is when she got her history timeline book, one of the first things she did was go in and put me and my husband's wedding on the history timeline. And it was like the cutest thing. And then she wanted to know about all of our other family members. And this was completely spontaneous, right? I never told her you should go look up our family. She's like, well, when did grandpa and grandma get married? What about great grandpa and grandma? What about suddenly she's like all of these people, because that to her was the most immediate real experience of history was her grandparents, right? Wait, grandpa was born the year after World War II? Great grandpa? What? That's real. And she's just her mind is being blown because she had that one missionary who was a missionary during the Second World War, right? We haven't read about World War II yet, but she's read about that missionary from World War II. And that was on the timeline. And then she saw grandpa was born in 1946, great grandpa. So now suddenly she's making all these connections. So this idea of we start with our own family history in the nursery years and then slowly expand to our local history. We have a local adobe that we like to hike to that is the oldest historical landmark in our area. It's not that impressive. It's just it's one little Spanish adobe. There's some plaques that explain about this family that was given 100,000 acres in California from the governor of California, 200 years ago. But we go to this place and we remember, and then we also go and they play on the rocks, and the rocks have the holes from when the Indians would grind the acorns. Mm-hmm. And everything about that experience is the reminder to them that we are not the only ones who have been here, that there are people who came before us, both Spanish settlers, Indians who had lived here for thousands of years, and that we are now a part of this shared experience of living in California. But what for them, before it was even California, right? Mm-hmm. Already these ideas are being built out in their mind and imagination in ways that I didn't need a book to teach them that. And in fact, no book could teach them that, really. Like them sitting there having their own time mashing the acorns in the hole, the rock. There's a word for it, and I'm so sad that I'm not remembering it right now. But as they sat and did that, that was a more real history lesson. As we talked about, do you know why there's all these holes on these rocks? It's because Indian women would sit there and grind for hours the acorns, because they had to dry the acorns to make the masa. Like, this was what they ate. That's why they were up here, guys. You see all these these oak trees with acorns? That's why they were here, because they could make all this masa. It's just, it brings it to life, and in a very simple way, though. I'm not talking about anything complicated. I just mean like
a unit study that you had to prep for and buy things for it. This was just going to your local historical spots.
Right. And it wasn't like I went in with my history objectives, like, we're going to go learn about how Indians lived in California. It was nothing like that. But then even like little things. So later, then we went to we went to a field trip, and they had in the bookstore, they had different books about the different Indians who lived here. Mm-hmm. So then we grabbed those books. Right. So but I didn't it wasn't like I knew, oh, I should go Google on Amazon which books to get, because, this knowledge that I don't even personally have, right? It was just, as soon as I encountered it, it was like, oh, well, this is perfect. We want to learn about that. So let's get those books now. So it's very organic, even though there is absolutely a structure in the curriculum, like I said, from doing historical fiction, which again, we start in year 3 through year 7. And then these layers of historical accounts, which are memoirs, essays, travel diaries, and then the medieval chroniclers, things like that. So there's a real history stream in the curriculum. Mm-hmm. But because we value the gymnastic mode of learning, especially in these school years, we understand that the most important history we are doing is going to learn about our own local history, mm-hmm. And prioritizing that. And so that's something I talk about in the curriculum. And I can just say, after this school year of getting to implement the curriculum and do it, like, it is such a life-giving way to learn history. And like I said earlier, all of the books we are doing are teaching history in some way. Like, what this curriculum is not absent or short on is history. There's so much history. It's just not in a didactic, boring textbook. Okay, here's this person and this chapter, just a boring walkthrough. It's just, it's immersive, it's experiential, and it's from so many angles and so many people and so many times, because that's what history was. And nobody remembers no 7-year-old remembers what order things happened anyway. So just embrace it. It's but they will, through doing things like their history timeline. That's what's so fun, is to see them make those connections, instead of telling them this person came, then this person came, then this person came. They get to open up their history timeline that we personally started around year 2 or 3. Mm-hmm. But definitely, I think by the school years, you should start doing that. And then they get to make those relationships and connections and be like, oh my goodness, this guy that I loved, he lived at the same time as, mm-hmm. It's fun.
Yeah, it's that signs of relations there. I also think one thing that my kids do, I'm sure yours do as well, is when they're trying to figure out either like a geographical place or something for like a timeline, they'll ask me, this world or another world? Like, if they've really fallen in love with a story and they're trying to understand, like, did it happen here? Like, can I put it in this? Can I find it on the globe or the map, or is it somewhere else?
Somewhere else.
I would really appreciate that. Or when they play, even my kids, some of them can be sticklers for having the right ensemble like they're wearing. So they'll, especially my daughter, be like, no, this kind of game would have a pinafore, and she has to go like find the pinafore that I sewed for her a while ago, or like, no, we wouldn't have that to eat. We'd have to have this to eat. And it kind of goes back to Mason's point that when you really dive in deeply into a single person's life, so their story, you learn so much about the time, how they were making their food, where they were living, why they chose those spots, what they would have been wearing, what their activities would have been. And I see that come out in play again, in that embodied form of like, no, you'd have to wear this to do that then, sort of thing. And they're just little details they picked up through their stories. This is totally just a personal thing for you and me, and now the internet. Did I text you when I found out that C.S. Lewis didn't like G.A. Henty?
I don't think you did.
Okay, so he loved G.A. Henty as a child, like the adventure
Mhm.
stories. He felt the same way about P.G. Woodhouse. And Amanda and I both love P.G. Woodhouse, where he basically thought they were both twaddle by the time he was an adult. It's the only time I've stuck my foot in this or drawn my line in the sand with Lewis and been like, "You're wrong."
I think I do suspect that this probably goes back to, like me and you said earlier, we are like third graders in the tradition.
So we're
So,
like, "No, I love this book." Yeah.
so, I mean, when you like, okay, so I read The Discarded Image this past year, which
Mhm.
is C.S. Lewis, right, is describing like the medieval
Maybe
mind.
mind. Yeah.
But in it, basically, what it felt like to me, 70% of that book was finding out all the books that C.S. Lewis read that I was for sure never going to read because he had A, way more time, B, was way more intelligent and academically trained and, knew all these languages that were like not even languages that anybody even knows the names of. Like he did some weird, he got into some very interesting stuff.
We did.
But like usually I read something and I'm like, oh, I'm going to go chase down that, chase down that footnote and I'm going to learn this. And I read The Discarded Image and my takeaway was I stand before the master. I'm
I will never name any book club the Inklings ever.
So at that point, I realized it was a moment of like, I don't think I'm ever going to be on Lewis's level. It makes it more impressive that he could write something like, Mere Christianity, which is so in the like common man's language because he was so, full of all these brilliant ideas and all like old thoughts. But yeah, I would imagine if we were reading super old ancient medieval texts, we probably would like outgrow Woodhouse. But since I don't foresee that happening for either of us, I think we can keep our love of Woodhouse and G.A. Henty.
Yeah. No, it's true. His back to your point that historically you didn't have like English literature the way we have to do like literature reading for classical education. That was not a thing. It wasn't even a thing for Lewis. Like as he was being educated, it was
Recently, yes.
Greek and Latin, history, mathematics. Like that was your education. But his leisure time was just reading excellent books from all over the world, all over the times. And so that's how he was able to read for his English degree in what, like a year instead of 3 or something, because he had read so much in his own personal life. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's fine. I'm sure he's right that Woodhouse is not what we need to be reading, but I still love it. And G.A. Henty, it triggered for me that I meant to text you when I came across that because I was like, oh, Henty, there he is. Okay. All right. So I've had you here for so long. Thank you for your time. I want to know about the launch for 2025, 2026, and also the little secret fun thing you have, if you can tell us about it and what people need to know about how to get there.
Yes. So we're launching the curriculum April 4th. Pre-orders actually will open March 7th. So you'll have a month to pre-order. But the very fun thing we are doing for the launch is that the weekend of April 4th and 5th, we are going, and by we, I mean me, I am going to do what are they called? Oh my goodness, a conference. It's pregnancy brain is kicking in. It is getting late. I'm like, what is it?
Almost end my time, so be kind to us.
Yes, exactly. But yeah, so I'm going to be doing a conference. A lot of TCT moms have asked me like, I want something that I could share with my friends or I could have my friends watch or, participate in that they don't have to like have the curriculum yet, but it might like give them a taste of what the curriculum has.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I'm doing for the conference, which I think will be equally helpful for those who have the curriculum, and it will come free if you get the spring edition, you will get the conference for free. But in addition, if you want to invite your friends who are not ready to buy the curriculum, they could also watch the conference. And we are just going to walk through things like a theology of education. Like what are the like foundational theological issues that undergird a Christian education that really any of us who are believers should be concerned with?
Can I
And
just
then
Amanda, that's like my favorite question because of how often I hear like, well, the Bible doesn't say I have to educate a certain way. And it's like, let us ask questions. What is a person? How are we
yes.
formed? To what end ought we aim? I'm so excited to hear you dive into this. I can't wait personally, just as I
It is really like that in and of itself is really like a pet topic for me because I am so passionate about it. I'm like, because that for me was, while I studied classical education for a few years, the big shift for me where it like just all clicked was when I understood that classical education wasn't merely this like, oh, well, I'm made this way. I like reading, therefore I should be a classical educator and should do this with my kids. But that, oh no, this is like fundamental beliefs about what a person is for.
Mm-hmm.
Like a person is made for communion with God. Okay, now what does that mean? A person is a knower. Okay, how do they know? Right? Like you said, there are all these very important questions that if you answer those questions wrong,
Mhm.
your pedagogy will reflect that error.
Yes.
It's not to say that every pedagogy that doesn't understand those things is going to be so far in left field that it's destructive, but there is actually a hierarchy of good, better, and best educational methods on the basis of how much they actually harmonize with the truth as is defined by God. Like reality is God. His mind is real and true, and that's where we understand goodness and beauty. So that is the basis for should be the basis for our education. And so I'm very excited about that one. But yeah, we'll talk about more about the ages and stages versus ages of man. We'll talk about poetic knowledge, going more deeply into what that is, gymnastic, musical education. So giving that broad vision again of what are the nursery and school years about? Like, what are we supposed to be focused on? What are we aiming to fill here? Training, attention, memory, imagination, getting to the core essentials so that this is to again encourage and inform those who are using the curriculum, and then even just I hope to encourage those who are in the classical education movement of like, let's think about how we're talking about these nursery and school years, and making sure that our ideas and philosophy is rooted in an actual tradition that can be defended on the basis of what has come before us. And so that will be April 4th and 5th. There's now a children's tradition Instagram that is run by my lovely friend and assistant, Ariel Tuttle. So she's running that for me. But if you go to that and follow that account, you will find more regular updates as it pertains to the curriculum and conferences. And then beyond that, we'll launch the curriculum and then hopefully have a baby a few weeks later.
Yeah, like you said to me, a baby on the back of a whirlwind. It sounds so apt. Okay, where else can everyone find you online? And I will put the link to the Instagram and the TCT homepage and all the things that we've mentioned. But where else can people find you? What projects do you have going on outside of just this?
Yeah, so I'm Mrs. Amanda Faus on Instagram. I don't post there super regularly, but when there is an update, I will post there. I do actually. Well, one of the main reasons I keep it, though, I will say, is I love getting to see people using the curriculum and sharing what they love about it. So I will, if someone tags me in something, I will always repost it because I love that. And I think for people who are inquiring into the curriculum, that really is the best thing they can see is what those who are actually using it, what their experience is like. And so I love that. But then in addition, yes, slowly but steadily, Patrick and I, every few weeks, put out a new episode on the Wonder Years podcast. We have the Wonder Years Substack, where at some point, some version of an article on the ages of man will appear. And that's about it, though. I don't pretend to have any big plans beyond launching this curriculum, finishing. We have a local tutorial program, the Colosse Classical, that I do reference regularly throughout the curriculum, and then in the toolshed, just as a point of reference for what it might look like to build a community around these ideas. But other than that, yeah, I'm just gonna try to enjoy my summer. I think I heard from you that what we're supposed to plan to do after having a baby is to plan to do nothing. So or something like that, or have low expectations. Somebody said that, you, in a Mother Academia video. So I'm going with that. That's what I'm doing.
Yes, because you don't know what to expect. And you need to
Don't.
bond and heal and care for the other children in your home. You need at least like the traditional 40 days. There's a reason why ancient church practices protects that 40 days. You have to as well. So for everyone who's emailed me in the last 8 months, I'll get back to you in June or July. I apologize.
Of 2026.
No, I hope I come back. But I do plan to return to YouTube. We will get started again on the podcast. I've mainly been in Common House because that is where I have expectations that I have promised to fulfill. So kind of like
And
you.
continues to have wonderful, wonderful content from you and from other moms. So
Yes,
Common House really is just a bastion of wisdom and joy and delight. I'm like, it's just the best. So anybody who's not in Common House, the 2% of people watching this video who are not in Common House, by all means, you should be in Common House.
No, it's great. We do have some other moms who have led groups and slow reading groups. Like I am not the smartest woman in there, I like to say, because it is a special group of classical women. So anyways, Amanda, thank you so much for reviving my YouTube for this snippet of fun for something so important, because I really do want people to know about this. I just think it's like full through the wardrobe. Like this is you are in the wardrobe. And it's such a tremendous gift to families. And like I said, everything that I've heard from everyone has echoed my own experience on a year that could have been kind of a drab year, being pregnant and not fully with it. And like, everything that comes through each trimester, it could have been a year that felt like, well, we did our best, but it was hard. But instead it felt like, yes, struggling is part of reality. We're all in this together. There's no, again, apart from God, there is no reality. And the struggle is an invitation into humility and faithfulness. And then we are blessed by these amazing realities that, do great things to us. So your curriculum has been a great tool and a great way to continue on that path for our family this year. And I've heard from others. So well done to you. Links will be below or above, hopefully both, if I can get the technology to work. And everyone, please give Amanda a follow and check out the Children's Tradition. And we will be back to you after we have babies.
Exactly.
Bye, guys.
Thank you so much, Autumn, for a wonderful conversation.
Bye.